This is Book Splash, the premium books program on Splash FM 105.5 Ibadan, and it is the platform for book lovers and writers. I am Michael Olatunbosun. The book for today is titled Power, Politics and People's Welfare, the Magnetron Technology, a New Window into Power Generation. The author is Alamu, Muda, Ayeni, and the book was published in 2021 in London by Austin Macaulay Publishers. The author, Alamu Muda Ayeni, is an inventor and writer. He has written quite a number of books and articles, including the book He Murdered Sleep, a commentary released following the Nigerian transition from military to civil rule in 1979. Other titles by him include Armor of Light and Towards a Stable Social Order, Adelabu Speaks from the Grave. He was the special assistant to Dr. Molulu Olunloyo, the then governor of Old Oyo State, from October 1st to December 31st, 1983, when the administration was truncated by a military coup d'etat. The author opens the book Power, Politics and People's Welfare by preparing the reader for an exploratory venture, the venture of properly diagnosing and preferring solutions to the existential problems militating against individual and communal development in third world countries, especially in Africa. The author also tells the reader that the book is a text on appreciating the ultimately indispensable role of electricity in human life and how to generate it in a more efficient way. And from all indications, it is clear from the beginning of the book that the author is basically interested in a world where innovative thinking and responsible leadership holds the torchlight, which shows the way to sustainable development for all, especially the people of Africa. The author here relates the story of American conquest of space by getting the first man to land on the moon, but quips about which is important, conquering space or making Earth more habitable. So he acknowledges that while the American government still invests heavily in space exploration, emphasis has shifted to the general well-being of citizens. Thus, building on this, he writes, and I quote, "This American example of focused, responsive governance, typical of other governments in Europe and the Far East, is an eye-opener to political leaders in charge of state affairs, especially in Black Africa, where nothing seems to work for lack of foresight, inspiration, social responsibility, and personal integrity of leaders. In such bedeviled countries of the Black continent in particular, leadership must change from the insipid set of psychotic treasury looters to an enlightened and service-oriented crop of administrators." End of quote. The author believes that when this is achieved, then the continent will be set free from the hold of underdevelopment and be on the path of seeing what he describes as sane planning and conscientious execution of beneficial social programs that can stand the test of time. For the author, there are twin obligations of a responsible government. They are protection of life and property and provision of guaranteed means of livelihood. While the protection of life and property is easily possible through the equipping and organizing of defense and law enforcement agencies, the author thinks that the creation of employment opportunities, quote, involves the full mobilization of inventive and innovative talents for purposes of industrialization. And it is in meeting this latter requirement that governments usually commit a breach of the social contract by failing to provide citizens with diversified means of livelihood owing either to low or non-development of available natural and human resources. In effect, therefore, the general low level of social and economic development in African countries is traceable to the utter disregard which African governments treat the all-important element of creativity in the process of nation building. The program is Book Splash on Splash FM Ibadan, and I'm discussing the book Power, Politics and People's Welfare, the Magnetron Technology, a New Window in Power Generation, authored by Mr. Alamu Muda Ayeni. The recurring theme of the book has to do with application of thought to the solution of problems. The author is apparently preoccupied with the glaring failure of leadership on the African continent to make a mixture of knowledge, science, innovation, and selfless service work to emancipate the continent. It sees the failure of the intelligentsia and education to make this happen, specifically blaming the fact that education merely breeds incompetent humans whose ultimate achievement is the acquisition of certificates, which only graduates the holder to the class of the clueless. A damning verdict announced by the author is that even those with some education have no innovative sense, to the extent that they cannot discover anything, including those in their backyards, without the help and prompting of the West. For the author, a key stumbling block to development and progress in Nigeria is the campaign of calumny, which contemporaries and colleagues of the innovators crowd them out, or what the author describes as, quote, Nigeria's characteristic official torpidity, end of quote. And the author of the book is here, Power, Politics and People's Welfare, Mr. Alamu, Muda Ayeni. Welcome to Books Plus, sir.
Thank you very much.
Tell me about this book. Why did you write it?
Well, first of all, let me thank you for the opportunity to talk about the book. The question which you have posed, the simple answer I give to it is simply that I see it as a mission. And that's why I'm on earth. Part of the mission is to do certain assignments which will benefit humanity. So that's the basic reason.
I see that you have in the first part,
Yes.
in the first part of the book, you have you preoccupied your time talking about making life meaningful for the people.
Yeah.
And you put that responsibility at the door of governance and leadership.
Yeah.
You think that the leadership in Africa has failed the African people to
That's
the extent
true.
that most, if not all of our discoveries and inventions were done by people from the West who traveled from their own domains to come here and discover things in our backyard.
Exactly.
I've also been wondering why the typical black man is like this. You have seen the world. You have traveled across the world. Tell us what your own exploration of the mind of the black man has brought out.
Well, thank you very much. As I said, that's a very thorny question. Thorny in the sense that we have as many perceptions of our minds as there are human beings. But basically, the typical African sense of perception is self-centeredness.
Self-centeredness.
Self-centeredness, that is, how do we get food, how do we get wherewithal of decent existence and things like that. We rarely think of service to humanity in general. That's our basic problem. And, in our contemporary living style, what we are concerned with is how to gain the most. Let me give you a typical example. In terms of investment, for example, the typical African man does not want to invest on anything which does not bring immediate benefits. That is essentially different from the spirit of those from the West. They take a lot of trouble to explore, unknown seas and see what they can get out of it. If we go back to ordinary history, you know that the exploration from their own native land into African shores was carried out by initially seafarers who had the courage to weather the storm and see what they could get out of it. And that is a spirit of adventure. Here we need the same kind of spirit before we can achieve much.
Wow. The spirit of adventure is also reflected in your work. You were in this book. You were talking about the fact that we're not paying attention to invention, initiative.
Yes.
As a matter of fact, we seem to have left the whole sphere of invention to people who are basically science people.
Yes.
And you contend in this work that an inventor does not necessarily have to be a science person, but somebody who is just curious and the flair.
Exactly.
That's basically your thought in this work.
Yes.
I like that thought. I want to push forward here. And you were talking here about the fact that we don't have a sense leadership in the direction of innovation. You said this lack of knowledgeable leadership has been responsible for the mass of confusion concerning who exactly is a scientist.
Yes.
And the consequent inability to distinguish between paper qualification and the innate quality has always led to the enthronement of mediocrity in the place of merit. Right. And basically that is what you have from top to bottom in Africa.
That's true.
Are we going to get out of this?
Well, we only pray. But we have to start somewhere. Otherwise, there will be no end to the suffering.
Okay, it's still Book Splash on Splash FM 105.5. I am still discussing the book Power, Politics and People's Welfare. Mr. Alamu Muda Ayeni is still with me. In what seems to be an extension of the author's thematic preoccupation, the work continually seeks deep ways of making nations transcend the realms of backwardness. Thus the submission, I quote now, the lasting solution to technological backwardness and the approach to self-reliance as well, therefore, lies not in buying, borrowing or stealing, nor in transfer of technology. It lies pointedly in the government's ability to sift the chaff from corn, to mobilize all available talents and organize diverse researches in a manner that gives hope for positive results. So the author calls for a large dose, if possible, an overdose of research, scientific research, and funding of real scientists who are gifted, dedicated, patient, and persevering. Indeed, he addresses Nigeria to take a cue from this. Engage as many scientists as are available, stir up the many dormant research establishments, and that failure to do this will further strengthen the glaring retrogression that pervades the nation. The precarious situation of the nation will linger long. That's his perception in this book. Now, one big question for me. You have called on the governments in Africa, and particularly Nigeria, to begin to launch into science and resuscitate the dormant, or if you like, moribund research institutions. Based on what we've been seeing, it has been very difficult for the African leaders to muster that kind of mindset. That we also need to drive innovation and research for Africa to measure up. We are going to be on this lane for long. You said we should pray. But in your work, you are an inventor. In your work, you have set to work rather than just pray to solve the problems. So I'd like to challenge you in this area as I come into your invention in this book. You have this concept or this thing called the magnetron technology, or the SS magnetron. I want you to tell me about it. You wrote about it long time ago, almost 40 years now. What exactly was it that pushed you into this?
As I said earlier, it's a very long story. At the time, I was in the higher school certificate class at King's College. There were moments of inspiration, uncontrollably one. You know, if you know what I mean by inspiration, it's not something within the human power to control. You just wake up and then begin to feel that you are being controlled by some forces you don't see and you can't control. Now, at that time, it was so serious that at a point I had to write the school authorities, because I made some jottings at that time about governance generally. But as would be expected, the school authorities thought I was insane. So I had to be taken to Dr. Marinho, who was the mental guru there, to examine me, whether something was wrong with me. And funny enough, after days of examination, the man confirmed that I was quite physically all right. But I have quoted that aspect to let you know what the inventor or whoever has that kind of initiative often goes through. But at the end of the day, I then decided to go to work directly and prove my method. That was what brought about all these ideas we're talking about.
I will come back to that magnetron in a moment. Let me just conclude this section of it. For you, the unbridled astronomical population growth in Nigeria, coupled with large-scale unemployment and the atmosphere of live and let die, are combining to create a low tempo of economic development, crime, and inevitable space age primitivity. So, in this work, you believe that our population, if uncontrolled, is going to put us into trouble.
Sure.
Of course, the reflections are already here: the banditry, the crime, the kidnapping, the terrorism, and the rest of it.
Yes.
But it looks like the people in government are still living in denial.
Good. As far back as 1979-80, I published a book which you referred to earlier, How a Mother Sleep. That book x-rayed the problems of Nigeria and the causes and offered or preferred solutions.
Okay.
But you see, as I told you, we don't have the kind of dynamic leadership. Most African states are governed by people I would call despots. Despots in the sense that most of them are concerned with only their own interest without any hope or any thought of assisting the ordinary people. They don't care. And as long as we have people like that in the leadership, we will continue to have the problems.
So, a lot of people say that we get the leadership that we deserve.
Well, that's one very funny, or let me say, not just funny, but apt description of the situation.
So how did we get to that juncture, sir? That's a big question that we've been trying to answer for long now.
You see, to give an illustration of that particular expression, if people deserve the government that they have, we are supposed to be running a democracy, for example. In a democracy, at least on paper, in theory, you choose people whom you believe that will govern you well. And you do so voluntarily. If in the process of doing that, you come out with a leader who turns out to be either a thief or an uncaring leader, then you cannot blame God or anybody for that kind of leadership.
So how do we cure ourselves of this malady?
Well, through education, through enlightenment, by telling our people what to do in order to expect, or rather to reap what you expect. If, like the typical Nigerian electoral system, people queue up and they are giving money, they say vote for party 1, vote for party 2. If they vote on the basis of the little peanuts they are given, they will eventually become slaves under that kind of leadership, because they will be used and then later dumped to their own peril.
Wow.
So that's the problem. But if we're able to enlighten or educate our people that, first of all, you have to consider your own tomorrow before you vote for anybody. What you vote with, the people you vote for now, will have an impact on the generation of your own children. And that's the problem. So unless through such public enlightenment, and then, as I hinted there, a reversal of our educational program, we'll continue to have that problem.
A reversal of our educational program?
Yes.
That's some matter for another day. Good. Let me return to your book. In this book, the author devotes a large span of pages to underscoring the prime place of power, or what you call electricity, in the total survival, life, industrial and socio-economic progress of humankind. He writes that all technological inventions are practically useless and lifeless without electricity. Conversely, the author here notes that while electricity generation from fossil fuels has helped in the course of progress, it has also constituted ubiquitous nuisance, threatening the world ecosystem. He thus states that efforts must be on inventing or consolidating the efforts made so far in exploring other sources of electricity, mainly renewable sources. At this point, the author, Mr. Alamu Muda Ayeni, introduces us to his own contribution to help deal with declining power supply, which holds the promise of ending the large-scale environmental pollution. This invention is named the SS magnetron. So in succeeding pages of the book, the author meticulously breaks down the nitty-gritty of his invention, the magnetron, which he says is a follow-up on the work of Michael Faraday. In the first instance, the author takes us on a voyage of the early ventures of men into the intriguing world of electricity. It tells us about efforts by great scientists and curious inventors in their attempts to light up the cities of the world. It then lays out the shortcomings of the global apprehension of solar and fuel methods of generating electricity. Ultimately, the author then informs the reader that he has worked hard for more than 2 decades to find an answer to the global power generation problem. It is a solid-state alternator called the SS magnetron, which, quote, operates without such environmental pollutants as noise and smoke and requires minimal attention in service, end of quote. Writing further in praise of his invention, the author gleefully announces that the SS magnetron will, quote, alter the rural landscape and urbanize the erstwhile slums and jungles of the earth. Agriculture will be revolutionized everywhere with increased food supply as villages are lit up and farm processes are mechanized. Industries will spring up in multiples to generate mass employment, while the quality of life in general will be much better enhanced. End of quote. Tell me about the SS magnetron.
Well, from the analysis of power generation in general, the man who is credited with the foresight of creating that equipment is Faraday.
Yes.
He stumbled on this thing during his experimentations as the director of British Institute, a research establishment.
Yes.
So he has 2 fundamental experiments. One in which he tried to move from known knowledge as at the time. It was earlier discovered by, I've forgotten this man's name now, I remember it, who discovered that the electricity produces magnetism. So he tried from there, but he wanted to see the reverse of that discovery. Okay, if electricity produces magnetism, is it not possible for magnetism to produce electricity?
Okay.
That was what led him to the invention of the dynamo.
All right.
So, Michael Faraday is known as the father of all electrical generation. All generations up to date is based on that technical discovery. But out of his two experiments, the second one, which tries to generate current from magnetism by rotation or by moving the magnet across the coil of wire, is the basic pattern of construction up to date.
Okay.
But it has some problems of its own. The first problem, the mechanical disruptions, arising from rotating machinery, wear and tear. The second problem is the need to have an appendage rotating equipment. If you have a picture of the typical generator, the area that actually generates electricity is a small part.
Okay.
Whereas the large engine,
that drives it.
Yes, the one that drives it actually occupies more space and resources because you need either petrol or diesel,
maintenance.
So it is this appendage equipment that makes it less efficient.
And it also contributes to
a lot of
emissions, and noise and the rest of it.
Yes, creating environmental problems for humanity. So the idea is how to eliminate all this. From my own work, I found out that the first experiment which he performed, that is, there were 2 sets. The first set, it tries to get electricity generated without moving the magnetism at all.
Okay.
It does that by finding a way of creating intermittent flow of this magnetism across the coil. So, but in such a process, it was able to get intermittent flow of current, not a continuous one.
Okay.
That intermittent flow was so small that it could hardly be detected.
Okay.
But at least it's proved the point that by moving relative motion between magnetism and a coil of wire, you get electricity generated. Because that process does not give a continuous flow of current, it was not considered workable to produce large-scale electricity.
Okay.
That's why that process has been abandoned since its day.
Okay.
The current one is considered more workable, feasible, because once you get
the machine running, electricity generated.
So the idea then was that how can we solve the problem of the first experiment?
Okay. To popularize it.
Yes. Not only popularize, to get a result.
Okay.
Comparable with the current
system.
So that was what led me to that.
So how much of success have you recorded?
Well, you know, in invention problem or in invention matters, what you first need is to get, through experiments, to get a solution to the problem you are after. Once you get a solution to it, the issue of, or rather the magnitude of success is not something that should concern you immediately. What you need to be concerned with, if I place this in one way or the other, I get this result.
Okay.
So thereafter, after series of refinements, you can then go into details of how to get the thing on a large scale.
All right.
That is why, for example, this new development is yet to be patented, so to say.
Okay.
So it is when that stage is reached, then people from elsewhere in the world will do a follow-up and probably even refine the whole thing to get the kind of level you want to get.
Okay, so it has not been patented?
That's the next stage.
That's the next stage.
Yeah, that's the next stage.
But you've achieved some measure of mileage
on
the magnetron.
Yes.
So what more do you want? Are you looking for instance, patronage from government or research institutions or research-minded persons? What exactly is it that you want?
The work is now beyond the issue of patronage for anybody.
Okay.
Because when patronage was required,
you didn't get it.
It was nowhere to be found.
Oh wow!
In fact, I had gone to the end of the research, so to say, before a few people got interested and they decided to train their weight behind me, giving me needed financial support each time I needed it. So, if you read through that book, particularly the acknowledgements, I have a long list of
very long list of personalities.
People who at one time or the other played an important role. You see, the African environment, which is where we started from, we don't see far enough beyond our noses. I'm sorry to use
that's big.
Yes, very big indictment, so to say, but I'm sorry to use it, but that's the truth, that's the reality. If any black man claims to see something unusual, the first thing is to disbelieve him.
You even said it that the colleagues and fellow inventors or practitioners in the person's industry will begin to say, what do you know?
Yes, exactly. So that kind of, because it leads to a lot of frustration. And unless you are really determined or you believe you have a mission to fulfill, you will just abandon the whole thing.
Is there hope that we'll get this your invention to work for us in a few years?
There is. And that is why this book has to be internationalized.
What do you mean by that?
Yes, the book in your hand was originally published here.
Of course, yes.
In 2012. But there was some lukewarmness on the part of those who are supposed to have got the message and act on it. So the hope that is on it now is that when it is in the right environment, they will do the job.
By the right environment, who are you talking about?
There is a portion in that book where I referred to the British people.
Okay.
And I made a quotation out of one of their publications, Thinking Britain. That's the title of the... Yeah. It's a pamphlet. In that pamphlet, they gave reasons why in the white environment there is room for innovation and invention.
We can make that happen here too.
But we have to be pushed, maybe by the whites.
That's a very damning verdict as well.
Yes, well, I read an article on the internet. Now, what he was saying, in essence, is that even though we claim that we have obtained independence from Britain, we still need them to push us before we do the right thing.
The book, Power, Politics and People's Welfare. What is your key message from this book for all of us?
The key message is that we have to brace up. We have been dormant long enough, and because of that dormancy, we are not achieving anything. You see, when we talk about progress, my yoga, not a lawyer, used to say that progress is in two directions, up and down, then the vertical and the horizontal. So before we can make appreciable progress, we have to brace up. We have to be ready to explore the unknown. We have to be ready to sacrifice. Until we do that, we remain standstill on the same spot.
Mr. Alamu Muda Ayeni, thank you for sharing your thoughts.
I'm very grateful for the opportunity. Thank you very much.
In the final analysis, the book, Power, Politics and People's Welfare, the Magnetron Technology, a New Window in Power Generation, is a well-researched work which the author has carefully written for the appreciation of all readers, even those with no science backgrounds. The 7-chapter book is laid out in 95 well-laid-out pages, including an appendix page. It is a reader's delight, and I recommend this book. By the way, this book is going to be launched pretty soon. Watch out for it. And that's the end of Book Splash for today. I'd like to say thanks to you and ask you to join me next Saturday, same time, for another edition of the program Book Splash on Splash FM 105.5 Ibadan. In case you have a comment or query, you can send me a text message 0805-699-8676 or email Olatunbosun@splashfm1055.com. You can follow me on Twitter @MikeTunbosun. My sound manager is Victor Daudu. My name is Michael Olatunbosun. I urge you to read the book today.